Hi everyone, I'm Jane at the Stitchin' Post, and I'd like to welcome you to our June 2021 edition of Viking Club. We have two topics today, one of which is kind of a necessary topic and the other one is just fun. For our necessary topic, we're going to talk about care and maintenance of your sewing machine. Maintaining your sewing machine is very important. Fabric and thread create lint. If you think about your dryer, what would happen if you never cleaned the lint screen in your dryer? It would be a major problem. So it's very important to clean and maintain your sewing machine. So we're going to have Karen Davis, our Husqvarna Viking technician, talk to you about that. And then we're going to switch to our fun topic, which is English paper piecing today. So with that, we will turn it over to Karen.
Hello, I'm Karen with the Stitchin' Post, and I'm the service technician. And today I'm going to show you how you should clean your machine. First off, we're going to take our bobbin cover off. Then we're going to take our little screwdriver and put it under the tip right here and twist it so that it pops that cover off. We'll take our little horseshoe piece out, take our bobbin case out. And you do notice that I have the machine turned off. And the reason I do that is we're going to move the cutter over to clean behind it also. So you'll take your screwdriver and put to the left of it, and it's going to be kind of tight, but push it over. There's a little piece here that flips up, and there's a little Velcro. And you can just take your fingernail and kind of rub over it, and it will get any lint that's on that off. If this little piece should come out, it just has a little post and sticks right back in. So we're going to take that back out. You'll also notice that the fetcher on this side has a little hook that's sticking out when the thread cutter is all the way to the right, and occasionally this will get caught on thread and stay out because it's not really attached in the back but by a little bitty tiny post. So this is also how you would put that back in if it should come out and start catching your thread. So I just have it pushed all the way back, and when I take it's kind of tight in there because I pushed it over really far. Make sure that's down, and you'll watch this will move back over when I push it. See, it moved back to the back, and now it's caught in the back. To clean your machine, you're going to want to never use canned air because canned air will blow all this lint back into the computer boards. I prefer Q-tips, but you do have a little brush that comes with it. You're going to want to clean here in this area, and you can stick it way down in there and clean as much as you can out. You're going to clean around here. You're going to clean in this little spot right here, and I have found if you'll put your Q-tip on the right side of the feed dogs and push over, you'll be able to see the lint come over here, and you can grab it with some tweezers if you have it. There's also, when you turn the hand wheel, there's this little hole in the hook area. And you can take that and turn your hand wheel and clean all up in there. So all the way around, clean it really good. This machine is really clean, so you're not going to see that. And then get it back to your original position. And that's all there is really in cleaning this. If you want to use a vacuum attachment like you use for your computer, you can go ahead and use that and suck whatever lint else you can see. But you really need to have a Q-tip or your brush to stick down in there and get down deep because some of that lint will be caught up on the gears in there. Then to put it back together, you're going to take your bobbin with a metal piece towards you and you're going to cup it down in there. And I always take it and do this to make sure that it's seated correctly. This little black tab needs to be to the left of this ledge here so that it's seated correctly. Then we're going to take our little horseshoe piece, and it has a tab on the back side of it. So it needs to stand up and then go down. Then we'll take our stitch plate, and it has a tab on this side of it, and that has to be totally flush with the back so that it will clamp in. If you have it and it doesn't go all the way back, then your needle's going to hit the front of your needle plate. And we're going to pop that back down, and then we're ready to put our bobbin in and put our cover on. You need to do this about every 8 hours, and I also change my needle at the same time. And I don't mean 8 hours of sitting at your machine. If you sit at your machine for 8 hours a day, probably on average you're only actually sewing for about 2. The rest of it's going to be prepping and getting your stuff ready and pressing. So do about every 8 hours of sewing. So I would say about every 4 or 5 days. If you use your machine every day, you do need to clean it out and put a new needle in. And that's how you're going to clean your machines. Hi, this is Karen again, and I just wanted to show you why you should bring your machine in once a year for me to clean it. This machine had been cleaned like we talked about earlier, really good on the inside, so looks are deceiving. When I pull the covers off, you can see, and this is not even one of the worst ones. I've seen them when it's totally felted on there. You can see all the lint built up. It's also built up underneath the hook where you can't see, and it's starting to kind of get up. We call it flocking. It flocks that lint up in the head of the machine. And these are places that you can't get to. So you need to bring it to me to clean all this out, because when this lint gets on the gears that are pre-lubricated, it sucks all the lubrication out of them, and so you'll have dry gears, which is not good for your machine. And this was just a chance for you to look and see what one of these machines looks like when I take it apart.
So that was, I think, a good little review of how to go about doing your own preventative maintenance on your machine, as well as a little bit about the job that Karen does on your machine when you bring it in. You can bring your machine in for service. You're Husqvarna Viking. Karen will she services them in the order that they come in. So you bring it in, we check it in, get it in line. Usually takes 1 to 2 weeks. Just depends on how busy she is at the time. You're welcome to call and inquire before you bring your machine in. We do have the little vacuum cleaner attachments that are great for cleaning those small areas in your machine. Also great for your computer keyboard or any other electronics like that. So just remember not to use the canned air like Karen said. We'll move on now to the fun part of our Viking Club today, the English paper piecing.
Several of us here at the Stitch and Post are major fans of English paper piecing. We'd like to share our love of English paper piecing with you today by telling you a story that we hope you will find interesting and inspiring. Let's start with the basics. What is English paper piecing? It's a traditional method of wrapping fabric around geometric paper shapes and hand stitching them together to form a patchwork. The papers serve to stabilize the fabric, and by hand stitching the pieces together, you can achieve incredible accuracy that would be extremely difficult or even impossible if you were stitching by machine. English paper piecing is commonly abbreviated EPP, and we will be using that abbreviation going forward in this presentation. So yes, English paper piecing is a form of handwork. I'd like to remind you that handwork is not just about the product, but it is also very much about the process. We often speak in a joking way about sewing as a form of therapy. It's really not a joke. Actually, there's a lot of truth to that, and particularly when it comes to handwork and other forms of repetitive motion, psychologists and neuroscientists have found that repetitive movements induce changes in brain chemistry that can significantly reduce stress levels. Hand stitching has been shown to decrease heart rate by up to 11 beats per minute, with corresponding decreases in blood pressure. Moving your hands in physical activities like hand sewing, embroidering, knitting results in activation of some brain circuits that generate sensations of satisfaction and well-being. It can be similar to what happens in meditation. Here you see the basic process of English paper piecing shown by using hexagons, which are a commonly used shape in English paper piecing. And you see a couple of shapes here that have been basted to the hexagon papers. These two have been whip stitched together, and more pieces have been added on these two to form hexagon rosettes. In addition to the hexagons, many other shapes are used in English paper piecing. In fact, early on, squares and triangles were the most commonly used shapes, with the other geometric shapes coming into play later. So when did English paper piecing actually begin? We know that it was sometime in the 1700s. The oldest known piece of English paper piecing that has survived is the 1718 Coverlet, which is currently on display in England. The oldest American-made piece dates back to about 1807, and again, these are the pieces that we are aware of because they have survived. This is a photograph of the 1718 coverlet, which was made in silk fabrics. You can see that many of the blocks are appliqued, but some of them were English paper pieced, and some papers were actually left in place on this quilt. The artist is unknown. We know that her initials are EH, and the papers left in the quilt help to date this item, as they frequently do in instances where the papers of the English paper piecing had not been removed. This photograph is of an early American hexagon quilt. This one dates to 1830 and is currently on display at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, along with a number of other early American quilts. Again, we don't know who the artist was in this particular instance, but as we move forward, we'd like to discuss some English paper piecing artists that we do know of, both from previous years and from today. So let's start our discussion by talking about Albert Small. Albert was born in 1885 in England. He came to the United States in 1903 and settled in Ottawa, Illinois, where he worked as a heavy equipment operator and explosives handler at the Ottawa Silica Sand Company. He was a collector of a number of different items during his life, including tropical fish, cactus plants, stamps, salt and pepper shakers, among others. He was an artist who painted with both oils and watercolors, and interestingly enough, he was a tattoo artist as well. His wife was a quilter, and she was friends with some other ladies who were quilters, and he apparently was teasing them about the quality of their work and perhaps insinuated that he could do better, and so they challenged him to give it a try, and he did. He made his first quilt in 1938, which was an English paper pieced quilt using half-inch hexagons. This quilt is 102 by 84 inches, so the number of pieces calculates to 36,141. He went on a year later to challenge himself to make a quilt with even more pieces. This one was made in 1939. It's 116 by 87 inches and contains 63,460 pieces. They are 3/8 inch hexagons. Hexagons are measured by the side, so there are 6 3/8 inch sides on a 3/8 inch hexagon. He made his third quilt, and actually final quilt, during the years of 1941 to 1945. He really wanted to make a quilt that would stand as a record of having the most pieces, and he wanted that record to be long-lived, and indeed it is. This quilt is 95 by 86 inches. These hexagons are extremely tiny, as you'll see in the next photograph. This quilt contains 123,203 pieces. The resolution is not great on this photograph, but you see here an area of the hexagons of his quilt with a dime in place, and this is the overlay showing how many of these tiny little hexagons would fit under a dime. So obviously These are incredibly, incredibly tiny. So that is Mr. Small. A contemporary of Albert Small was Lucy Basting. Lucy was born in Lancashire, England. Her maiden name was Wood. She was born Lucy Wood in 1892. She led an interesting life. She volunteered as a nurse during World War I. Subsequently, she married a distant cousin and had one son, Peter. Her marriage failed actually in 1935, and subsequent to that, as a single woman, she went on to purchase a manor house near the village of Hemmingford Gray in 1939. This photograph shows the manor house at Hemmingford Gray, which was built in approximately 1130. It's one of the oldest continually inhabited residences in that area. When she purchased the house, it was in need of considerable restoration work, and in the process of doing that restoration, she purchased some patchworks, which she used for various purposes in the home. You see here one of the patchworks is being used as a curtain. There was some repair work that needed to be done on some of these patchworks, and as she began doing that, she became interested in creating patchworks of her own, which led to an interesting and important chapter in her life. You see here another patchwork that's in an area of this awesome, beautiful, ancient home. This is the garden around the house. Lucy was an avid gardener. She put in many, many hours creating an English garden surrounding this manor house. The gardens really had always been neglected, never really had been developed. And she did a lot of work during times of the year when it was suitable to be outside. She put in many hours developing these gardens. This is a photograph of the garden from the side of the house. Another photograph of the garden here showing many beautiful irises. So this was an important aspect of Lucy's life, but during the cold times of the year, she worked on her patchworks, and this is one of her patchworks, one of her originals that she created. Here is another example of one of her patchworks in neutral colors. And this is another example. These are all English paper pieced. That was her method of choice, and that was probably pretty much exclusively her form of stitching. Interestingly enough, she was also a novelist, and she published some adult works, but mostly she was known for her children's books. Her first publication was in 1954, at which point she was 62. So that gives the rest of us some hope that maybe we'll still go on to do something worthwhile in our lives. So she published first at age 62, and she's best known for the series of books about Green Knowe, which was a manor house loosely based on her own home at Hemmingford Gray. The first of these books is called The Children of Green Knowe. The books were illustrated by her son Peter. I have read a couple of these. They're very enjoyable reading. They're fantasies. She conjures up some interesting characters as she imagines people, children particularly, who may have lived in this home previously. So I'd encourage you to explore these, read them, perhaps share them with children in your own life. This is another of Lucy's patchworks, and this is really the most famous by far. This patchwork is shown on a bed in the manor house, and I know you can't see the design particularly well in this photograph. It's shown better here. This is the Patchwork of the Crosses pattern. You see that these are English paper pieced blocks. that are joined together with a rim of light colored blocks, and then little squares set on point, and bigger crosses at the intersections here. Here's another example of a patchwork of the crosses block that has been joined together with additional English paper piecing. You can also choose to create the basic block, which is this portion, and applique that onto a background block of solid fabric, and that way you do incorporate some applique, and you don't actually have to stitch as many pieces together if you choose to go that route. We have many new, beautiful, colorful, interesting fabrics that can be fussy cut to make patchwork of the crosses blocks, and we have come up with some of our own here in the Stitch and Post, and we'll be showing you those. We will have kits for those available for those of you who are interested in creating your own patchwork of the crosses blocks. Moving on now to current English paper piecing artists, we just have picked a couple to talk about. The first one is Katja Merrick. She was born in Germany, came to Canada at age 8, and eventually landed in Columbus, British Columbia. She sewed since she was very young. Her mother was a trained tailor, so she grew up under the sewing machine. She currently owns a quilt shop, as well as writing books, designing patterns, and teaching. One of her books is the new Hexagon, which has very interesting modern English paper pieced hexagon blocks. This book was the basis for the Hexagon Millefiori sew-along that she did several years ago, and we actually participated in this one here at the Stitch and Post. This was from another sew-along that she did subsequently. It was called Blocks on the Go for Quilts on the Grow, and again used these interesting hexagon blocks that were pieced using various shapes of subunits. The new Hexagon Calendar you may have seen. This is a perpetual calendar that I believe we still have available in the shop. That has these hexagons made with these intricately arranged, interesting subunits. Katja's most recent endeavor has been a joint venture with AccuQuilt. She has put together a book of English paper piecing projects that AccuQuilt has published and has promoted to accompany the English paper piecing cube that they have come out with for their fabric cutter. We are an AccuQuilt dealer, and we would be happy to talk with you more about this cube and the shapes that are available in it. It can be used to cut your fabrics as well as your papers for your English paper piecing. In this photograph, you see Nisha Bori on the left and Kim Mortucci on the right. These ladies became well known several years ago, and the story began with Kim, who actually is a meteorologist, and she worked for some period of time in the Basting area, and during that time she visited the Brimfield Antique Show, which is held several times a year. And after leaving Boston, she and her friend Nisha came back to Brimfield to visit the antique market, and they were quilters. They were interested in vintage textiles, and so in walking through the Brimfield market, Kim described how you could tell when you were coming to a vendor that had textiles. I think we all know the smell of vintage textiles. It's maybe a little bit musty, but basically very, very interesting to those of us who like that kind of thing. And so they came upon a vendor who had trash bags full of textile items. And in going through these trash bags, they found this quilt block, which they deemed appropriately the Brimfield block. And this is an English paper piece block. You see that this one actually has some curved pieces here. So in looking into the history of this pattern, it seems that it was originally introduced probably in the late 1800s, and somewhere in the 1920s it was published in the Kansas City Star. So Kim and Nisha made some alterations and adjustments in this block and introduced it as the Brimfield block, and you see it here made up in a finished quilt. We have the papers and the acrylic templates available for this block. This one is made in Liberty Lawns, which obviously is a beautiful way to do this, and we'd be happy to talk with you more about the Brimfield block. So moving on now to the nuts and bolts of English paper piecing. What are the basic techniques? Well, first of all, you have to cut your fabric shapes. It's easy if you use acrylic templates with seam allowances added, but you can trace your paper pieces and add seam allowances yourself if you prefer to do it that way. You can fussy cut your fabrics or not. That's going to depend on the fabric, and it's going to depend on your preference. If you choose to fussy cut, that will involve choosing a motif within the fabric and placing your template so that you center that motif exactly as you want it within your shape. By fussy cutting, you can achieve amazing and intricate designs that are quite impressive. If you use an acrylic template, you can cut your pieces using a 28mm rotary cutter. You can't use a smaller rotary cutter because the wheel of the blade is too small to actually clear the acrylic template. This is an example of hexagons which have been basted with fussy cut fabric pieces so that you see each one of these is exactly the same, and when this is pieced together, whip stitched together, it's going to yield a very nice paper pieced design. The star blocks in this photograph show some fussy cut pieces, such as the little flower here. The stripe fabric here is fussy cut so that that pink and blue stripe is exactly at the point of each of those star shapes. This geometric piece here is also fussy cut so that things are lining up in the star as you go around. Here you see that this motif is in the center of each one of these pieces. So fussy cutting can really give you a very impressive result. These blocks again are fussy cut for the most part. There are some pieces in here that may not need to be fussy cut, but in general you get a wonderful kaleidoscope effect. This one's got birds and flowers around the edge. Wouldn't be the same if it were not fussy cut. The second of the basic nuts and bolts techniques of English paper piecing is basting your fabric to the paper shapes. This is done either with thread or with glue. Both of these methods are good. They're both widely used. They both have advantages and disadvantages. Here you see a hexagon that has been thread basted. You see the stitches of the thread basting in place around the hexagon shape here. And you see that each of the corners is tucked so that this has been stitched all in the same direction going around here. Thread basting may give you some advantage in removing your papers after your pieces are stitched together. It may be easier to reposition your templates on your fabric if you're fussy cutting and you perhaps didn't get your paper template exactly in the right place the first time. Stitching can be removed and replaced to get your piece exactly where you want it. Disadvantages of thread basting. I think it's more difficult to thread baste when you are utilizing curved pieces such as the Brimfield block, and certainly thread basting is much slower than glue basting. When you glue baste your paper pieces, we recommend using a Sewline glue pen, which is a refillable glue pen. You place the glue along a side of your paper shape. Don't get it all the way up to the edge. Leave yourself a little stitching room there. Put a line of glue and fold your fabric over. Another line of glue, fold the next section over. So again, you're going in the same direction all the way around as you're basting these, whether you're thread basting or glue basting. That will give you an advantage when you are ready to stitch your pieces together. Glue basting, I find, is a much easier way to baste curves, and certainly glue basting is much faster than thread basting. Some people feel that it is more difficult to remove your papers when you have glue basted, but not everyone feels that way. Karen Davis here in the shop feels that glue basting actually is easier to remove and allows you less damage to the papers than you have during thread basting, so that you can actually easily reuse your papers. You do have the added expense of the glue, and some people find they do not like the glue residue present on their pieces, although the glue is water soluble and will wash out completely from your finished project. The last of the basic techniques in English paper piecing is stitching the pieces together to form the patchwork. Most commonly, the basted pieces are placed right sides together and a whip stitch is used to stitch them together. Stitches are very small, 16 to 20 stitches per inch. I don't count my stitches, but yes, that is approximately the number of stitches that you will come out with when you take tiny stitches. You take tiny bites of fabric, only a few threads at the edge of the papers, and again, if you have glue basted, you try to keep your glue a little bit away from the edge of your fabric so that you're not actually stitching through the glue itself. Thread preferences vary considerably among English paper piecers. Some prefer to stay with cotton thread, and 50 weight Aurifil is a favorite of those that prefer cotton. It's best if you use a thread color that matches or blends with your fabric, and you'll likely find you can't use 80 weight Aurifil because it is too delicate and wears as you stitch along the edges of those papers, and you will have a lot of thread breakage. Some people prefer to use polyester thread because you can use a finer polyester thread because polyester is stronger. So you can use a finer thread, which will make your stitches less visible. So this is a personal preference situation, and you will have to decide what you like to use for your English paper piecing. I'd like to move on now and talk about the tools used in English paper piecing. The first one is the paper shapes that you use to wrap your fabric and stabilize your fabric to stitch your pieces together. The easiest and most successful shapes to use are those that are die cut, because they will be cut accurately and your pieces will fit together correctly. They're cut from cardstock. They are strong enough that they can be reused, whether you thread based or whether you glue based. Our favorite papers come from Paper Pieces. They have a large variety of shapes and sizes of die-cut papers for English paper piecing. Acrylic templates, again, are very helpful. This acrylic template is also from Paper Pieces. This one has a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Some have only a 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's a little bit easier, I think, to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance because it gives you a little bit more wiggle room when you're placing those templates for fussy cutting. You can either trace these templates or you can use them with a small rotary cutter, the 28mm rotary cutter. The templates, as I said, are not essential. You can do English paper piecing without the acrylic templates, but these will make your life much easier. Karen K. Buckley Perfect Scissors are great if you're not using a rotary cutter. These are great for cutting your fabric. I like them especially for cutting the curved pieces of the Brimfield block. They are micro-serrated, that they allow you to cut very accurately and very easily. The handles are ergonomic. The blue handled scissors are kind of a medium size. I find that I use those most often when I'm cutting English paper piecing shapes. If you are doing thread basting, you can use 50 weight Aurifil thread. That will work fine. The color doesn't matter because the thread is going to be removed. It's not going to show in your finished project, so you can use up odds and ends of thread that you have on hand if you're thread basting. If you're glue basting, you will want to use a Soline glue pen. This is a water-soluble, refillable glue pen. You'll want to use it sparingly so you don't have an excess amount of glue in your project. And you want to apply it slightly away from the edges of the paper template so that you will not be stitching through the glue when you stitch your pieces together. Needles, again, this is somewhat of a matter of personal preference, but you will want to use a fine needle because that will help you to take small invisible stitches. Karen's favorite needle is the Tulip applique needle in size 10. My favorite is the Foxglove Cottage straw or Milner needle in a size 11. That size 11 does bend a little bit over time as it's used, but I have not had it break. I find that my hand fatigue is somewhat reduced by using a needle that's a little bit longer, but you will need to try it and find the needle that works best for you. When you're stitching your shapes together, again, you want to make small stitches that are as inconspicuous as possible, and that will be easier when your thread color matches your fabric as closely as possible. Some people use pretty much exclusively 50 weight Aurifil cotton thread to stitch their pieces together. Others prefer the fine polyester thread in either 60 weight or 80 weight, which allows you to make very fine small stitches that are really quite invisible, and it is resistant to breakage because it's polyester. So we have both the 50 weight Aurifil cotton as well as the Deco Bobs, which is an assortment of bobbins containing various colors of 80 weight polyester thread if you would like to try that. I think for curved piecing and if you are using a finer fabric like the Liberty of London lawns, I find the polyester a little bit easier to use in that situation, but for stitching straight seams, stitching my pieces together, I like to use the Aurifil 50 weight. Some other tools that you might find helpful in English paper piecing would be a mechanical pencil or a Fixion pen if you're tracing your shapes, a sandpaper board to lay your fabric on to keep it from shifting while you're tracing. The 28mm rotary cutter can be used with your acrylic templates. Thread conditioner is helpful, particularly with your cotton thread when you're stitching your shapes together. Wonder clips and or Sew Tight magnetic pins are helpful for holding your pieces together because you can't really use pins to hold those pieces together, but having a device to hold them together as you're stitching will help to reduce your hand fatigue. A fussy cut finder or a magic mirror will be helpful as you're deciding where to place your template on your fabric for fussy cutting. A small rotating cutting mat can be helpful, particularly if you are rotary cutting your pieces. A variety of containers for storing your pieces and your blocks will be useful to you. And the last one on the list here, the purple thing, this is Karen's favorite item for sliding that rectangular end of the purple thing under her fabric edges to loosen them from her papers when she has finished sewing together her glue-basted paper pieces. So just a couple of quick photos here to give you some additional ideas and inspiration for using English paper piecing. Here's an example of a Dresden quilt that has been English paper pieced. Dresden shapes are one of those paper shapes that are available from paper pieces. Here's a pillow that has some paper pieced hexagons. You don't have to do a huge project. You can use a smaller number of pieces and do a project like a pillow, or perhaps a placemat. These placemats have areas here of English paper pieced hexagons. Here's a tote bag that's made up of, again, hexagons that have been English paper pieced. This is a kitchen towel that has a single hexagon rosette. So again, a small project that you can play with to try English paper piecing without taking on a huge project. And I found this interesting. This is a garment that has a yoke and pockets that have been cut from fabric sections that have been English paper pieced, prepared in advance, and then had the pattern pieces laid on. So this is actually a children's garment, but it certainly could be used in an adult garment as well. We hope you enjoyed this story of English paper piecing and that you're ready to jump in and start making your own stacks of hexes or whatever shape you might choose. We are going to have a video demonstration now by Karen Davis, who is going to show you her technique for stitching her paper pieces together.
Hello, I'm Karen Davis, and I'm going to show you today how I sew my English paper pieces. First off, when you use Aurifil thread, the way it is wrapped on the spool, you must bring it from the top. If you bring it from the side, it makes it kink, and you're going to get lots of knots. Once I do that, I put it in my needle, and I run it through a thread conditioner. And I run it through there twice. That way I make sure that it gets good and coated. Then my pieces, I've already basted, and I do glue basting. And you'll notice my dog ears. One goes one way and one goes the other. I start in the top left and work my way around when I'm going to baste these. And that way they're going to nest really good when you get up there to put them together. So we put them together, and I make sure my points are good. And I use sew tights, and I actually use all three kinds because different shapes, it's easier to use different on different pieces. Then I take my thread, I've not knotted it at all. I'm going to go through the very points of these two pieces. And I leave, about 3/8 of an inch tail. And I kind of hold it with my finger, and I go back through that point again. And then I come through, and it's basically like a surgical knot. And I tighten it. That secures it enough that if it ever comes loose, it's only going to go to that knot. And I'm going to do that on both ends. In fact, if I have a long piece and there's different intersections in that piece, I do a knot at each one of those so that if I ever have to, it ever comes undone, it's not going to undo my whole piece. Then I take that little tail, and I'm going to go under the tail, and I'm just going to catch, sometimes you have to take that little piece and move it over. I'm just going to catch the top 2 or 3 threads on the piece. I don't want to go into the side, I just want to go across the top because we don't want the stitches to show on the other side. Then I'm going to do, and I do my stitches fairly close together. Make sure I catch the one on the other side. You get faster as you do it. This is an odd angle for me, so it's kind of hard to keep that tail from wrapping around that corner. But you notice that my thread is not knotting up at all. It's not tangling, and it's because I brought it off the top of that spool and I ran it through a conditioner. And I'm encasing that little tail I left into the whip stitching so that it's good and secure, so that it's not going to come undone. Here again, my stitches are pretty close together. And I'm not going to go all the way to the end because you're just going to do the same little knot, catching this tip with this tip. If you see one side is going to be a little bit longer than the other, say if I wanted, this one's a little bit longer, so I want to bring it in. So I'm going to go over a little bit longer than I normally would, but in the back piece, I'm going to go ahead and come through exactly where I would have to begin with. And that's just going to ease that little bit in when I pull it tight. And you see, sometimes you have to do it 3 or 4 times to get enough easement in there to pull it up. But once you get to the end, it's going to pull that in. See, already just a couple of stitches and it's already more even. And then I would do that all the way to the end, go through the point, and do my little knot again. And that's how I stitch my English paper pieces.
That wraps up our Viking Club presentation for today. We'll end with a quick walk-around tour of some of the quilts and small projects that we have on display for you today.